If you are listening to this story at night, perhaps in a room where some of the lights have already been turned off, perhaps when the sounds outside have thinned out, leaving only the steady hum of a fan, the low murmur of the air conditioner, or the slower rhythm of your own breathing, then I invite you to pause for a moment. I have always found this moment special, not because of the hour itself, but because of the thought that at this same instant someone is listening. As their city lights are just coming on, someone else is listening. Long after midnight has passed, someone is lying in bed. Someone is driving through a long stretch of road. Someone is trying to fall asleep. Tonight, I want to begin with a slightly strange thought. You may believe that you are living in a modern world. A world of artificial light, of digital calendars, of emails, messages, push notifications, of smartwatches, tracking your sleep, and apps reminding you to drink water. Everything looks new, fast, very different from the past. But if you truly are living in a modern world, I want to ask you a very simple question. Why is your life still governed by reactions you never consciously chose? Why can a single alarm sound pull you out of sleep with something close to panic? Why can you sit still for hours yet feel restless when you are not doing something useful? Why do you feel the need to apologize for resting, for replying slowly, for failing to keep up with the shared rhythm? These are not lofty philosophical questions. They are deeply ordinary. So ordinary that we rarely stop to ask them. We usually say, that's life, that's society, that's responsibility. But the truth is, many things we call normal are simply very familiar. And that familiarity does not come from modernity. Many of the habits you live with every day were not born from science, were not designed by psychology, and are not the result of a rational evolutionary process. They come from the Middle Ages. Not the Middle Ages you see in movies, not knights on horseback, not stone castles or blood-soaked battles, but the Middle Ages of daily rhythm, of invisible discipline, of standardized fear, of a world in which people believed they were always being watched, not only by the community, but by a larger order higher and impossible to bargain with. It was a world where falling out of rhythm was not merely inconvenient, but dangerous. What is striking is this. We often think of the Middle Ages as an age of ignorance full of superstition left far behind. But history does not function like a room you can clean out and then lock. History is more like an old habit, kept not because it is still right, but because no one remembers why it was once necessary, and everyone fears what might happen if it were abandoned. The Middle Ages ended as a historical period, but many of its logics were preserved and given new names. Human beings rarely erase the past. They repackage it. What was once called sin becomes lack of awareness. What was once labeled moral deviance is renamed cultural incompatibility. What was once punished with the rod is now corrected through glances, through silence, through shame learned very early in life. We no longer believe that God is watching every action. But we do believe that an invisible standard is watching us every day. A system with no face, no voice yet, with the power to make you adjust yourself before anyone needs to say a word. This is the deepest legacy of the Middle Ages, not doctrine, but the habit of self-surveillance. In the medieval world, discipline was imposed from the outside. In the modern world, discipline is implanted on the inside. You don't need anyone to judge you, you do it for them. You measure yourself against shared standards. You adjust your behavior so as not to fall out of rhythm. And the paradox is this, we call that state freedom. Tight schedules, lists of what one should do, ways of living considered proper. Many of these are not grounded in solid scientific evidence, but in an ancient fear, the fear that if human beings loosen discipline, order will collapse. The Middle Ages believed that if people failed to follow ritual, the world would fall into sacred chaos. Today, we believe that if people fail to follow norms, society will fall apart. Different language, same structure. The past does not disappear. It hides. It lives in how we organize time and how we judge others, in the vague unease we feel when someone lives out of rhythm. And perhaps the reason the Middle Ages never truly left is not that humanity failed to progress, but that we still need old structures to soothe a deeply human fear. The fear that without discipline, without norms, without someone or something watching, we would not know how we are supposed to live. If you are listening to these words at night, try asking yourself, among the habits you keep, what truly helps you live better, and what exists only because it has been there for so long that you no longer dare to imagine an alternative. We no longer say obedience to God, we say self-discipline. We no longer say sacred order, we say culture. We no longer say sin, we say irresponsibility. The words have changed. The feeling has not. The feeling that you must keep the right pace. Be on time. Respond correctly. Live in a way that is reasonable. And if you fail to do so, the fault lies with you. There is a very common illusion that modern society loves to cultivate that people today are more rational than their ancestors, that we are less governed by invisible fears, that we act from understanding, not ritual. But look again at an ordinary day. You wake up to a sound you do not like. You work according to schedules you did not choose. You rest with the feeling that you are wasting time. You communicate according to rules that, if broken, will earn you judgment not through violence but through glances, silence, or words that are very soft and very heavy. If that is not a form of discipline, what is? Only one thing has changed in the past. Discipline was hung on church walls through stories of punishment. Today it is embedded in work calendars, evaluation systems, and social norms that everyone voluntarily follows. The reason the Middle Ages lasted so long was not because people were stupid. It was because they lived in a world where order meant survival. Falling out of rhythm could get you excluded, suspected, seen as a threat. And the reflexes formed in that environment do not disappear just because the world has become safer. The human body remembers for a long time. Fear remembers even longer. We carry those reflexes into the modern world like an old coat, no longer fitting, but familiar enough that we never quite throw it away. In this entire story, I do not want you to think of the Middle Ages as something distant. I want you to think of them as a background operating system still running inside modern life. An operating system that shapes how you understand time, how you feel guilt, how you judge yourself and others. We will not talk about kings, not about wars, not about grand events. We will talk about small things: work hours, etiquette, the table, rest, greetings, apologies, the feeling of being good enough or not. And each time we will return to the same simple question: where did this come from? Not to blame the past, not to glorify the present, but to recognize that human beings do not change as quickly as technology. And that order once carved into daily life continues to exist, even after the reason for it has long disappeared. So if there is one thing to take with you after this opening chapter, it is not a date or a historical term. It is a feeling. The feeling that when you rise at the sound of a bell, when you shake hands by reflex, when you apologize for resting, when you feel you should do just a little more. Perhaps, very possibly, you are not acting like a modern person at all. You are simply doing what human beings were taught to do a very long time ago. And in the next chapter, we will begin to peel back the first layer of that operating system. Not through philosophy, not through morality, but through the thing that has governed everything else from the beginning: time. Not the time of the universe, but the kind of time used to keep human beings in rhythm. We will listen to that bell again. If you're still listening, it's very likely because something in the previous chapter hasn't fully closed. Not a clear idea, but a vague feeling, like the moment you've just woken up and still don't know what day you're in. That feeling is a suspended state where the past and the present haven't had time to separate. And it is precisely in that state that we're going to talk about something that was already there long before you were able to form the first question of your lifetime. Not time in the physical sense, not the steady numbers running across a clock, nor the precise motion of the planets. but time as a mold, an invisible shape into which human life is poured, and then little by little hardens inside it. Time does not only measure life, it arranges life, reshapes it, and evaluates it. And what matters is this: long before you were born, the shape of that mold had already been decided. Think about the first moment of a very ordinary day. The alarm sounds not like an invitation, but like a short command that requires no explanation. That sound cuts through sleep, cuts through dreams, cuts through every personal reason your body could offer to stay a little longer. And almost immediately, you do what you learned long ago: you get up. Not because you have carefully weighed the benefits and risks of waking at that moment, but because your body has become accustomed to reacting to time. We often tell ourselves a story that sounds perfectly reasonable, that we wake up because of work, because of responsibility, because modern society runs fast. But that reflex was not born with email or online meetings. It is far older than that. It was sharpened in a world where time was not a personal resource, but a collective power. For many centuries in the Middle Ages, there was a group of people who lived their entire lives inside the exact repetition of moments. Not because they lacked imagination, but because they believed imagination was precisely what needed to be silenced. They did not measure time to save it, nor did they divide the day into blocks to optimize performance or accumulate achievements. For them, time was not something to use, but something to surrender to. Each hour was marked not to serve human needs, but to slowly wear down personal will until a person stopped placing themselves at the center of life. They were monks, people who entered cold stone monasteries with a silent agreement to give up the right to decide the rhythm of their lives. Inside thick walls where light slipped in through narrow openings and the cold never fully disappeared, days were not organized around bodily feeling. No one asked whether they were tired, whether they were hungry, whether they were sleepy or filled with energy. The body was not allowed to speak. It was only allowed to keep up. There, time did not flow in the way we usually imagine. It did not move forward like a river. It turned in circles, closed, repeating itself day after day. Each morning resembled the one before it. Each evening carried the same shape. Any difference, if it existed, was not in the schedule, but in how much a person had learned to disappear into the rhythm itself. When every moment has already been set in advance, the only thing left to practice is not skill, but submission. The bell rings and everything stops. Not because the work is finished, not because someone has thoughtfully decided in a reasonable way that this is enough. Everything stops because that moment was fixed ahead of time. In that space, the question, "What do I want to do?" is not merely discouraged, it almost doesn't exist. Personal desire is treated as interference, as a kind of noise that must be quieted, so the sacred order can be heard more clearly. The only thing that matters is not what you are doing, but what time it is now. Time inside the monastery does not need to explain itself, and it does not need to persuade. It offers no reasons. It does not negotiate. It simply appears through a metallic sound thrown into the air and demands to be obeyed. And through the tireless repetition of that obedience, day after day, year after year, time is transformed from a tool of measurement into a moral standard. Being on time in that world is not merely keeping rhythm. It is proof that you have learned to place yourself in the proper position within the shared order. Being out of time is not merely inconvenient. It triggers suspicion. It raises questions about devotion, about the purity of intention. Gradually, time stops being the background of spiritual life. It becomes an invisible yardstick used to evaluate a person's rightness. And it is here that something crucial happens. Something whose effects reach far beyond the monastery's stone walls. When obedience to time is repeated long enough, it no longer needs the bell. It becomes internalized. People begin to feel right when they are on time, and wrong when they are not. That feeling does not require external punishment. It exists on its own, like an echo left behind in the chest, reminding you that order must always be preserved. Those monks may not have known they were creating a model for the future. But by living inside a closed loop where time is the subject and the human being is the object, they laid the foundation for an enduring idea that a proper life is a life that can regulate itself to match a rhythm already set in advance. And when that idea leaves the monastery, moving into towns, into workshops, and then into society at large, it carries not only the sound of the bell, but also the feeling that time always has the right to demand that you stop even when you are not ready. At first, this was a closed life, almost separated from the outside world. But a monastery does not exist in a vacuum. Its bell rings beyond the stone walls, spilling into the space of the town, the market, the workshop. Gradually, even those who were not monks began to adjust their lives to that sound. Not because they believed in the same sacred reasons, but because a community cannot function if each person lives by a private rhythm. This is a major turning point in human history, the moment time becomes shared. From that point on, being out of rhythm is no longer a harmless personal choice. It becomes a sign, a signal that you do not fit, that you are not reliable, that you do not belong. And when something begins to carry social consequences, it soon acquires moral consequences as well. When the world enters the industrial era, we are often taught that the modern work schedule is a product of machines, factories, and the demands of mass production. But that is only half true. The first factories did not invent time discipline. They inherited it. Church bells were replaced by factory whistles, hours of prayer replaced by work shifts. But the core logic remained unchanged. Human beings still had to arrive at the right moment, stop at the right moment, and leave at the right moment. Not because they had completed something, but because time had decided that the moment had passed. The biggest difference between medieval monks and modern people is not who is controlled more. It is this: monks knew exactly what they were serving. They believed that rhythm led to salvation. We meanwhile serve something far more vague. We call it standards, schedules, procedures. Words without religious color, yet carrying a comparable pressure. Pay attention to how we speak about time in everyday life. We don't only say we have little time, we say we lack time as though it were a personal failure. We don't only say we rest, we say we waste time as though time always has some proper purpose that we have missed. That language is not neutral, it judges. And when language judges, guilt follows. The most subtle thing the Middle Ages left behind is not the clock and not the work schedule. It is the quiet, persistent idea that time is always right, and you are always capable of being wrong. Wrong for being late. Wrong for responding too slowly. Wrong for resting too long. Wrong for not being efficient enough. That idea does not need to be spoken aloud, but it lives in the way we evaluate ourselves every day. In the monastery, that feeling has a clear name: obedience. Obedience to the bell's rhythm. Obedience to the hours of prayer. Obedience to an order the individual has no right to bargain with. But in the modern world, we no longer use that word. We call it self-discipline, a term that sounds positive, mature, modern. Yet when you look deeper, what has changed is not the feeling, but only the figure who appears to impose it. Look at working hours today. In theory, they seem more flexible than ever. You can work remotely. You can choose time slots. You can bring work home or bring home into work. But that very flexibility makes time discipline more refined. There is no longer one shared bell ringing for everyone. Instead, there are hundreds of smaller bells, personalized, living inside the phone, inside email, inside calendars, and finally inside your own head. You don't have only one start time. You have overlapping time points, meeting times, message reply times, hours, when you must be present, online hours, when you must prove that you are working. And when the boundary between working and not working blurs, the feeling of being wrong also blurs, but it does not disappear. It spreads. You are no longer wrong because you arrived late. You are wrong because you didn't respond fast enough. Wrong because you weren't online. Wrong because you rested while there was still work unfinished. Here, time no longer stands outside giving orders. It has been moved inside as a standard of self-evaluation. No one needs to remind you that it's time to work. You become restless when you are not working. No one needs to criticize you for resting too long. You feel guilty on your own. And when that guilt repeats enough times, it becomes part of identity. You begin to believe that a good person is a person who is always busy, always in rhythm, always ready to sacrifice personal time so as not to fall behind. Working hours today, therefore, are not merely a block of time in a contract. They are a prolonged mental state. You may leave the office at 5, but the feeling that you are still not enough does not leave with you. It follows you home, sits with you during dinner, appears when you try to rest, and whispers you could have done a little more. That whisper is familiar. It does not sound like your boss. It sounds like you. And this is where the medieval legacy becomes most visible. Time still plays the role of judge, but it no longer needs a religious institution or a bell tower to do it. It borrows the language of performance, of goals, of self-improvement. It makes you believe that if you are tired, it is because you have not managed your time well. If you are exhausted, it is because you lack discipline. Time in this logic is never wrong. Only you are failing to keep up. In the monastery, obedience is the road to salvation. In the modern world, self-discipline is promised as the road to success. Two different promises, but an astonishingly similar mechanism. Both rest on the same underlying feeling that you must continuously adjust yourself to match a rhythm already set for you, and that falling out of rhythm is not only inconvenient, it says something is wrong with you. So when you look at working hours today, what is worth thinking about is not whether they are long or short, rigid or flexible. What is worth thinking about is what they make you feel. Do they make you feel as though you are always behind time? Or make you believe that time is something you must constantly please? If that feeling is familiar enough that you no longer notice it, then perhaps, even though the schedule has changed, the medieval rhythm is still ringing no longer as a bell, but as the quiet self-blame that rises every time you stop. No one stands in a bell tower watching you anymore, but the bell has been brought inside. It rings as notifications, reminders, personal targets, and expectations that do not need to be spoken. No one needs to force you now. You force yourself. And when you are tired, you do not think the rhythm might not fit. You think you are not good enough to keep up. This is not an accusation, and it is not a call to rebellion. It is only an invitation to look back to see that your reflex toward time is not a natural instinct, but a habit taught long ago, repeated relentlessly, and reinforced by reward and shame. A habit so old that we rarely recognize it has a history. In this chapter, if there is something worth keeping, it is the awareness that time as we live with it is not a neutral flow. It is a structure. And that structure was built in a world very different from ours. We inherit it not because it is perfect, but because it is familiar. In the next chapter, we will leave the large time blocks behind and step into a reflex that is small, everyday, almost invisible. A sneeze, a phrase spoken by habit, a moment in which you do not suspect you are reenacting history. And there we will see that time is not the only thing the Middle Ages left us. It is only the first thing that learned how to control human beings silently. There is a very small moment in modern life that almost no one questions. It happens so fast, you rarely even notice what you're doing. Someone sneezes, and almost immediately, a voice slips out, sometimes yours. Sometimes the person beside you, bless you. No thinking, no weighing, no waiting to see whether the other person actually needs it. The reflex arrives as quickly as a blink. If you don't say it, you might feel a little strange. If you're the one who sneezed and you don't hear that blessing, you might feel an absence that's hard to name. Not anger, not sadness. Just a very small, very odd gap. And it's that oddness that's worth stopping for. Because in the end, in a world that understands bacteria, viruses, immune systems, and the speed at which droplets spread, blurting out a religious-sounding wish after a physiological reflex is unnecessary. It doesn't heal. It doesn't protect. It doesn't change the biological outcome of a sneeze. So why does it still exist? And why does it endure so stubbornly that it has become an unspoken social rule? To understand that we have to return to a world where sneezing wasn't harmless. In the Middle Ages, the human body was a space of uncertainty. No one truly understood what was happening inside it. People didn't know about bacteria. They didn't know about viruses. They didn't know about the immune system. All they saw were outcomes: someone healthy in the morning, someone dying by nightfall. A village peaceful today. A village full of corpses a few weeks later. In that world, every small change in the body could carry life and death meaning. A sneeze in that context wasn't a light reflex. It was a sign. A sudden violent sound erupting from within the body where people believed the soul resided. A widespread belief held that when a person sneezed, the soul could be pushed out of the body or at least shaken loose. And if the soul was in that fragile state, the devil believed to be lurking everywhere could seize the moment and enter. That fear didn't appear in a vacuum. It was fed by disease, especially by the plague. When death moved faster than any explanation, people needed a story to hold on to. And that story often took a religious shape. If someone sneezed during an outbreak, it wasn't just a sneeze. It could be the beginning of death, theirs, or the whole community's. In that context, God bless you wasn't a matter of politeness. It was an emergency action, a rushed prayer, a way to intervene immediately in something people believed was slipping beyond human control. It was like shouting when you see someone lose their footing, not because you think the shout will stop gravity, but because silence in that moment is unbearable. In the 6th century, when epidemics were raging, Pope Gregory the Great officially encouraged people to say a blessing after every sneeze. In the logic of that era, this was protection for the soul, a thin barrier between humans and catastrophe. And from there, the reflex spread took root and was passed from generation to generation, not as a belief that had been carefully examined, but as a habit tied to survival. What's striking is this: the original fear has vanished, but the reflex hasn't. Today, almost no one believes the soul can escape through the nose with a sneeze. No one truly thinks the devil is waiting in that instant. But the reflex remains intact. And that reveals something deeply medieval. When a behavior is born from fear, large enough, it can survive long after that fear has faded. In the modern world, bless you is no longer a prayer in the literal sense. It has been softened, neutralized, sometimes even detached from religion. But its social function remains soothing unease. Not unease about the soul, but unease about disruption. A sneeze breaks rhythm. It interrupts conversation, quiet space, the shared flow of thought. and bless you appears like a quick bridge stitched in to patch that disruption. It says we noticed the anomaly and we handled it. Everything can continue. Without that blessing, the silence lingers a moment longer. And it's that extra moment that makes people uncomfortable. Not because it's impolite, but because it opens a gap, one that the collective unconscious once associated with danger. Here, the medieval panic reflex has been reduced, refined, and wrapped into a social ritual that seems harmless. But the mechanism underneath is still the same, a reflex triggered to deal with something uncontrollable. And if you look closely, you'll see that this mechanism doesn't exist only in sneezing. In modern life, we have many other sneezes. Moments that are sudden, unplanned, outside the logic of efficiency. An email not answered right away. Someone who suddenly goes silent in a meeting. A message marked seen with no reply. Rationally, these things aren't dangerous. But reflexively, they trigger the same feeling something is off. And then modern bless you responses appear. Not as blessings, but as reassurance behaviors, sending one more message just in case, adding an emoji to soften the tension, writing, just checking in, no worries, sorry for the late reply. These lines aren't always necessary in terms of information, but they do something important. They soothe an invisible fear that order is being threatened. In the Middle Ages, order was sacred order. In the modern world, order is communicative order, rhythmic order, expectation order. But when that order is interrupted, even for a small moment, a faint panic reflex still appears. And we respond to it with ritual. What matters is this. These rituals aren't taught formally. No one sits you down and explains that you must say bless you. You learn it by watching, by feeling uncomfortable when you don't do it. By noticing that society relaxes when you comply. And this is exactly how medieval legacy continues to live, not through textbooks, but through social reflexes. That reflex teaches us that silence can be dangerous, that unusual signals must be handled immediately, that not responding is scarier than responding incorrectly. And slowly, we carry that fear into other spaces of life. We fear pauses. We fear unfilled moments. We fear leaving something hanging without a ritual to close it. And like bless you, we learn to react quickly, sometimes too quickly, so we don't have to face the feeling of uncertainty. In the Middle Ages, invisible fear was assigned to demon souls and sacred punishment. Today, that fear no longer has a clear name. It has no shape, no mythology. But it still exists in the pressure to reply, to reassure, to make everything okay immediately. And every time someone sneezes and you say bless you before you've even had time to think, you are performing a very old ritual. A ritual born from the fear that something has just slipped out of control, and that human beings cannot tolerate that sensation even for a second. This chapter isn't telling you to stop saying it, and it isn't criticizing politeness. It's only inviting you to notice this. Even the smallest reflexes of modern life carry the memory of a world that once lived in panic. And when you notice that perhaps next time between the sneeze and the blessing, you'll feel that brief instant. The instant where history, fear, and habit intersect. Not loudly, not dramatically, but enough to remind you the Middle Ages never truly disappeared. They simply learned to whisper instead of shout. Perhaps no everyday object looks more harmless than a fork. It lies quietly in a drawer. It makes no sound. It demands no belief. It serves one simple purpose: to carry food from the plate to the mouth. And it is precisely because it is so simple that few people ever suspect that once upon a time, the fork was considered a moral problem. Not a problem of hygiene, not a problem of aesthetics, but a problem of right and wrong in the sacred sense. To understand that we have to return to the medieval table where eating was not merely a biological routine, but a stage for social order and moral discipline. For much of the Middle Ages, the European table was not a place of refined etiquette. It was a rough space where the human body met food directly without any intermediary. There were no separate tables for each person, no personal sets of cutlery laid out neatly in front of everyone. Food was placed in the center and shared. A knife was used to cut. Hands were used to take. People ate with what they were born with, and that was not only considered natural, but right. In the logic of that era, the human body was not a machine waiting to be improved. It was the finished work of God. The hand, 5 fingers capable of touching, feeling, lifting food to the mouth, had been designed to be sufficient for life's most basic acts. Placing a metal tool between hand and food was not seen as progress. It was understood as doubt directed at a sacred design. And in the medieval mind, doubting God's design, even in the smallest matters, always carried the scent of sin. It is in that context that the fork entered Western Europe around the 11th century, like a stranger. It did not come from the peasantry. It was not born out of survival. It traveled from the East, from the Byzantine Empire, where aristocratic dining had developed under a different logic. They are soft and sticky dishes, carefully prepared and elaborate, made eating with bare hands inconvenient. Small forks, sometimes made of gold or silver, appeared as a practical solution. Functionally, they made sense. But the moment they arrived in Western Europe, they collided head-on with an entirely different moral system. The church did not see convenience in the fork. They saw arrogance. Why would a human being need another tool besides the hands God had given? Why avoid touching food as if it were something unclean? In that interpretation, the fork was not merely metal. It became the symbol of a dangerous mindset, the desire to rise above nature, to refine what should have remained simple and unmediated. There is a story often mentioned in medieval accounts, more symbolic than historically precise. A Byzantine princess brought golden forks with her when she married into a powerful family in Venice. Local clergy reacted with outrage. They viewed the habit as luxurious, distorted, even insulting to faith. When the woman later died during an outbreak of disease, her death was explained as God's punishment, not for illness, but for the fork. Whether embellished or not, the story captures a fear at the heart of that era. The fear that small changes in everyday life could become the doorway to moral collapse. What matters is this: the hostility toward the fork was not driven by whether it was dangerous or useless. It was driven by the symbolic meaning people attached to it. In a society that believed the cosmic order had already been perfectly arranged, any improvement looked like an unnecessary intervention. Changing how one eats was not just changing a habit. It was changing how a person positioned themselves in relation to God, nature, and the community. But history rarely stops at the first wave of resistance. Over time, the European table changed, not because theology shifted overnight, but because society shifted first. Cities grew, aristocrats and merchants gained power. Banquets became theaters of status. Refinement gradually became a mark of civilization, and the fork, once condemned as arrogance, began to be reinterpreted as etiquette. That transition was slow, spanning centuries. For a long time, forks were used mainly to hold food while cutting, not to lift it directly to the mouth. The hand remained central, but little by little metal inserted itself between human and food. And with it, a new idea took root. The human body did not have to remain the final standard. It could be assisted. It could be upgraded through tools. From the present, the fork debate can sound strange, almost funny. But if we strip away the historical costume, a familiar pattern appears uncomfortably close to home. Every era has its own fork tools, habits, or technologies that are accused of being unnecessary, unnatural, or morally dangerous, simply because they disrupt what feels like order. Today, similar anxieties gather around smartphones, artificial intelligence, or even body-supporting tools, supplements, wearable health trackers. The core question is not so different from the 11th century. Are we improving the human being or losing something original? When is a tool support? And when does it become a form of arrogance? There is a deep common ground between the medieval world and the modern one. The fear that small, everyday changes can lead to large shifts in how we understand ourselves. For medieval Christians, the fork threatened the direct relationship between the human hand and God's provision. For us, technology threatens the direct relationship between the human being and lived experience, how we eat, sleep, love, remember, forget. The difference is that we rarely call this fear moral. We call it loss of identity, drifting away from nature, dependence on machines. The language changes. The feeling does not. And then something else becomes visible, a medieval motif that never truly disappeared. When people don't understand something or can't control it, they moralize it. But the story does not end with the fork. The fork is only the surface. Beneath it lies a deeper anxiety, the fear of losing moral control through tiny shifts in ordinary life. The medieval table was not merely a place to feed the body. It displayed rank, discipline, and social order. Who sat where, who ate what, who used which tools, everything signaled meaning. Eating with the hand was not just habit. It was proof of belonging to an established order. And when someone ate differently, it was not merely a matter of taste. They were deviating from the norm. And deviation, as we have seen, is always a problem. The church feared that if people began to alter small rituals like eating, then larger rituals, prayer, confession, obedience might also be questioned. The fork became a symbol of a boundary that had to be guarded. Not because it was physically dangerous, but because it opened the possibility that a person could live differently without asking permission. The irony is sharp. While condemning the fork for moral reasons, medieval society lived amid terrible hygiene. Bowls were shared. Knives were shared. Hands were shared. Illness spread easily through communal eating. Yet this contradiction did not shake the church's stance, because the issue was never health. The issue was the power to define what counts as right. Centuries later, as Italian elites began to treat fork usage as elegant, the trend spread. And as so often happens, what was once labeled sinful became a symbol of civilization, not because the object itself changed, but because the people using it changed. When the powerful used forks, it was sophistication. When the poor used forks, it was imitation. And when everyone used forks, history quietly erased the memory that this small object had once provoked a moral war. But the mechanism never vanished. It only changed targets. Today, we no longer argue about forks. No one rises at a banquet to declare that metal insults the natural order. No clergy warn that cutlery signals spiritual decay. But that does not mean the table has lost its moral function. It has simply changed its vocabulary. We still argue about eating, only now the argument is not whether you should use a fork, but how you eat. And from that, how a whole system of judgment forms almost automatically. How to eat correctly, how to be aware, how to be civilized. These words sound neutral, but they rarely remain descriptive. They slide quickly into verdict. Food stops being mere fuel. It becomes a statement about who you are. What you choose, what you refuse, and how you talk about it are read as moral signals. Eating clean suggests discipline. Eating healthy suggests responsibility. Eating ethically suggests care for society and the planet. And if you don't do these things or don't do them in the right way, an unspoken question appears: so what are you lacking? Almost no one says outright that a different eater is a bad person. But judgment does not need to be explicit. It lives in tone, in glances, in harmless-sounding remarks. I wouldn't eat like that. That can't be very good for you. People should be more aware these days. These aren't commands. They are invisible borders between the considerate and the not quite. Like the Middle Ages, modern moral control works best when it doesn't look like force. No one forces you to eat a certain way. But you know that if you don't follow the praised pattern, you may be required to explain yourself why you chose that, how you're still responsible, how you still belong. The need to explain reveals that the table is still a small courtroom where people are judged not for who they are, but for how they consume. And here, hypocrisy becomes clearer. Many modern dietary norms are marketed as personal choice, yet function as social standards. They are presented as freedom while carrying the expectation that a good person will choose correctly, a conscious person will comply, a civilized person won't deviate. Difference isn't banned, it is simply made uncomfortable. In the Middle Ages, the fork was condemned as arrogance because it created distance between the human hand and food. Today, failing to follow certain food norms can be condemned as lack of awareness because it fails to create enough moral distance between you and the world. The extremes differ, but the assumption remains the same that how you eat reveals your worth as a person. And this is why the fork matters as a story. Not because it is a utensil, but because it shows how societies attach power, virtue, and human value to the smallest gestures, then call that arrangement order. The modern table looks free. Each person has their own plate, their own space, their own neatly placed cutlery. It is clean, bright, standardized. And yet that standardization produces another kind of control. You learn to hold the fork correctly without being taught. You learn to cut correctly without a manual. You learn to chew quietly, to move in the approved rhythm because you can feel the gaze. Do it differently once, and the room changes texture. No one says anything, but the silence thickens. A brief glance, a polite smile slightly out of sync, and you understand you have stepped outside an invisible safe zone. Here, morality no longer bears God's name. It bears the name of civilization. But the feeling of being evaluated is ancient. The danger is not etiquette itself. Every society needs some order to share space. The danger begins when etiquette becomes moralized, when it stops being a practical convention and becomes a measuring stick for human worth. When the way you eat speaks louder than whether you are fed. When harmless behavior is tied to judgments about intelligence, class, or character. When the table becomes a sorting machine, refined or crude, civilized or not enough. Modern society loves this kind of control because it is gentle. It is not violent. It needs no strict laws. It requires only the gaze and the silence. People correct one another and then call that freedom. But real freedom may not be holding the fork correctly. It may be the ability to exist without constantly proving you meet an invisible standard, being allowed to eat in the way that feels comfortable as long as you harm no one. If the fork teaches us anything, it is not that the past was foolish. It is that societies have a habit: when they cannot control a change, they moralize it. And the table where everyone must appear every day is the perfect place for that moral training. When you sit down to eat, you are not only feeding your body. You are stepping into a space where history, power, and norms still meet. Each utensil, each gesture, each habit carries layers of meaning accumulated over centuries. And sometimes what looks like simple civilization is the end result of a long chain of judgments, prohibitions, and finally, forgetting. The fork won in the end, not because it was morally right, but because society grew tired of fighting it. And in that quiet victory, it leaves a disturbing question. How many other forks in modern life are being branded as moral issues simply because they disrupt our familiar sense of order? This chapter does not ask you to distrust every norm. It only asks you to recognize something simpler. Sometimes what we call morality is not born from genuine care for human beings, but from fear of losing control. And the table, though now clean, bright, and carefully arranged, remains a place where that fear once ruled and may never have fully left. There is an ancient paradox in the way human beings organize their lives. The more rules there are, the more we need moments in which we are allowed to break the rules. And the Middle Ages understood this more clearly than we tend to assume. Not through psychology, not through behavioral science, but through survival instinct. A society can endure only if it knows how to release pressure. What we now call a bachelor party, black mourning clothes, or the weekend may sound like scattered fragments of modern life. They belong to very different spaces: celebration, grief, rest. But if you look closely, they share the same invisible structure. They are rituals of release periods of time. Society permits people to step out of their everyday roles for a moment, so that they can return to order without bringing it down. In the medieval world, a person's life was bound to roll almost absolutely. Who you were born as was in most cases who you would die as. Peasant, artisan, monk, noble, each position came with duties, limits, and expectations that were clearly defined. There was little room to experiment with the self, no concept of finding yourself, and precisely because of that, society had to create controlled openings, small gaps it could manage. The bachelor party in its earliest form appears exactly where medieval society was most anxious the moment a person changes roles. In a world where identity was nearly fixed from birth, the shift from unbound to belonging to a structure was a major event not only for the individual, but for the social order around him. In the Middle Ages, marriage was not understood as an emotional journey. It was not self-completion through love. It was a stabilizing mechanism. Two families were joined, property was merged, lineage continued, obligations were distributed. When a man married, he did not simply have a wife. He became a unit with clear legal, economic, and moral responsibility. From that moment on, his behavior was no longer purely private, and because of that, this threshold carried immense psychological pressure. Not the pressure of losing freedom in a romantic sense, but the pressure of being permanently sealed into a frame. No more gray zone, no more retreat, no more space for actions that were not decided yet. And medieval society, however strict, was realistic enough to understand that such a total transition could not happen in silence. Before that threshold, society allowed, sometimes even encouraged, a night of chaos. But this was not indulgence. It was a collective psychological ritual. A way of saying to the individual, we know you are losing a state of life, and we are giving you a moment to say goodbye to it. The gatherings before the wedding were not meant to honor love, because love was not the center of marriage in that time. They were meant to purge freedom, not freedom as a noble right, but as a phase of life that had completed its function. Getting drunk, gambling, shouting, challenging others, acting foolish. All of these shared one trait: they were behaviors that could not exist for long inside order. They were loud, hard to control, and they produced no lasting value. And precisely for that reason, they had to be consumed quickly, burned through before the individual stepped into a new role. Here, society was not celebrating chaos. It was fencing chaos in. It was saying you may do all of this, but only here, only now. That is a very clear message. Chaos is not denied, but it is also not allowed to spread. It is packaged into an event with a clear start time and a clear end time. The most important thing lies in that boundary. Chaos is not permitted to spill into the next day. When the sun rises, the man must return not as a free individual, but as a husband, a member with a defined position in the social web. And all deviations from the night before are wrapped up in an unspoken understanding that is over. No one brings it up. No one pursues it. No one uses it to judge his future. This is what reveals the depth of the ritual. The bachelor party does not break marriage. It protects marriage by digesting what could break it. Instead of letting impulses of freedom smolder and find a way to erupt later inside marriage, inside responsibility, inside family life. Society allows them to flare up beforehand in a safe space witnessed and accepted by the community. And here, the community plays a crucial role. The people at the party are not merely friends, they are witnesses. Together, they confirm that the old state has been fully lived and that the new state can begin without carrying unresolved echoes. When everyone witnesses that permitted chaos, they also agree that it no longer has the right to return. Seen this way, the bachelor party is not rebellion. It is compliance with order at a deeper level. It allows a person to pass through the loss of an old self, the unbound self, without cracking the social structure. And for that reason, the ritual survives with remarkable persistence across centuries and across shifts in morality and law. Today, even though the context of marriage has changed profoundly, the psychological structure remains intact. A modern bachelor party may feel playful, humorous, even exaggerated. But underneath it is still a moment in which society acknowledges a person is about to give up a way of living, and that letting go needs to be marked, released, witnessed. And perhaps the most striking thing is not that this ritual exists, but that it still feels necessary. Because that suggests that even in an age that speaks constantly about individual choice and personal freedom, stepping into a major social role is still a powerful psychological shift. And in any era, human beings need rituals to cross those thresholds without breaking from the inside. Today, a bachelor party may look like nothing more than fun, but its psychological structure is almost unchanged. It is still a permitted moment to behave differently before entering a new social role. And what is interesting is that society does not merely accept this, it expects it. A person entering marriage without a last night of freedom can even be seen as lacking something. If the bachelor party is a ritual of release before a new beginning, then black mourning clothes are a ritual of release before a loss that cannot be reversed. In the Middle Ages, death was everywhere, but that did not make people used to it. On the contrary, death had to be controlled through ritual. And black, the color of mourning, was not a natural choice. It was a social convention with a performative function. Black was once a rare color, difficult to dye, and therefore associated with power and solemnity. When the nobility and the church began using it for funerals, it quickly became the symbol of proper grief. Not every kind of grief was accepted. It had to be expressed in a form that was easily recognizable, easily controlled. Black mourning clothes do two things at once. They allow the wearer to grieve, but they also shape how grief is performed. When you wear black, society understands you are in a special state. You are allowed to be quieter, slower, more withdrawn. But at the same time, society also knows when that state ends. When black is taken off, the ritual is complete. Grief must be placed back into the mold. This is crucial, because grief without ritual can become a threat. It drags on. It cannot be predicted. It disrupts order. Mourning dress, therefore, is not only for the dead, it is for the living, so they have a permitted pathway for sorrow instead of dissolving inside it. Today, we still wear black at funerals, though very few people know why. We call it formal, appropriate, respectful. But underneath it remains an ancient ritual allowing pain to exist inside a safe frame so society can keep functioning. If the bachelor party releases freedom that is about to be taken away, and black mourning releases pain that is being held in, then the weekend is a ritual of release for something far more familiar: exhaustion. In the Middle Ages, there was no concept of the weekend as we understand it. But there were many religious holidays and days of rest. Not because society cared about the mental health of workers, but because order needed to be interrupted, rhythm needed a break. A society that works without pause is not an efficient society. It is a society prone to collapse. The medieval church understood that people needed pauses that were legally and morally sanctioned, not to rest because they deserved it, but to return to labor with order reinforced. These holidays often came with food singing sometimes mild chaos. They were like safety valves. When pressure is released in a controlled way, order can last longer. The modern weekend carries that spirit with remarkable clarity. It is presented as a benefit. But in its deeper structure, it is an agreement. You work by the social rhythm for 5 days. In return, you are permitted to loosen that rhythm for 2 days, not to destroy the system, but to endure it for another week. What is interesting is this even rest is quickly standardized. There is a right way to rest. A weekend is supposed to be used for certain things. Rest that fails to recharge can be seen as waste. Rest that is not efficient can even produce guilt. Here, the ritual of release begins to be pulled back into the logic of performance. And when that happens, we see the medieval inheritance clearly. Even rest must be justified. Bachelor parties, black mourning clothes, weekends. 3 different rituals, but one shared function. They allow human beings to touch emotions that everyday order cannot tolerate: chaos, grief, burnout. But they allow it only within limits, within time, within approved forms. This is not cruelty. This is how society protects itself. But what is the cost of that protection? The cost is that people learn to feel only when permitted, to loosen only when scheduled, to grieve only when dressed correctly. In the Middle Ages, these rituals helped society survive in an uncertain world. In the modern world, they still help us avoid breaking. But sometimes they also make us forget that these emotions are not exceptions. They are a normal part of being human. And perhaps the most unsettling thought is not that we still keep these rituals of release, but that we are increasingly unable to allow ourselves release outside ritual. When everything must be at the right time, in the right place, in the right form, true freedom becomes rarer than ever. Ritual at its best is where human beings can breathe. But when ritual turns into obligation, it returns to its old position, another tool for maintaining order. And there, the Middle Ages, with all its sophistication and contradictions, still quietly whispers into the way we live, celebrate, grieve, and rest every day. There is a very modern assumption we rarely stop to examine, that the body belongs to us alone, that it is neutral, that it is safe, as long as there is no obvious threat. But history tells a different story. For most of human society's existence, especially in the Middle Ages, the body was always seen as a vulnerability, an open door, a place that could be entered, something that had to be managed, watched, and placed inside order. And that is why so many rituals that today look like politeness, civilization, or simply habit in modern life actually come from a deeper belief the body is never completely safe. A handshake is a classic example. Today, a handshake is understood as a social gesture, a greeting, a sign of goodwill. But its origins are tied to a fear of violence. In the Middle Ages, extending your hand forward with an open palm was a reassuring act: I am not holding a weapon. That gesture told the other person that this moment was safe, that you did not need to defend yourself immediately. A handshake, then, was not primarily an expression of friendliness. It was an expression of a temporary truce. 2 bodies moved closer to each other, something that was always dangerous, but the danger was neutralized by a clear, recognizable ritual. The brief, firm handshake with a distinct beginning and end allowed 2 people to enter the same space without triggering defensive reflexes. What matters is this: The ritual was not designed to create intimacy. It was designed to control distance. Not too far so it would feel hostile. Not too close so it would feel threatening. And that is precisely why the handshake has endured so stubbornly, because it answers an ancient need to make physical contact predictable. But if the handshake is a ritual that permits contact, then personal space is a ritual that prevents it. The idea of personal space sounds very modern, associated with psychology therapy and the language of individual rights. We often talk about it as a natural need. Everyone needs a certain distance to feel safe to avoid being violated. But if we trace it through history, we find that this concept did not emerge from respect for the individual. It emerged from a very specific collective fear, the fear of contagion. And the important point is this. In the medieval world, contagion was not only about disease, it was about morality. In medieval cities, crowded, narrow, and unsanitary, other people's bodies were always too close. There was not much space to avoid one another. No clear boundary between private and shared. In that setting, every contact carried risk. Other people could carry illness, this was obvious. But deeper than that, they could carry something considered even more dangerous: sin, spiritual impurity, or moral influence seen as deviant. The medieval church did not draw a strict modern line between body and soul. The body was not merely a shell, it was where sin manifested. A body that was improper was not only suspected in terms of health, it was suspected in terms of essence. And so uncontrolled bodily contact became a potentially dangerous act, not only because of germs, but because of the spread of what was wrong. Here, the fear of contagion moved beyond biology. It became moral fear. Touching someone was not merely touching their skin. It was touching their social position, their reputation, what they represented. And if that person was seen as impure, the poor, the sick, criminals, outsiders, or groups labeled as deviant, then that impurity was believed to be transmissible. That is why the church and secular society together built a detailed system of rules around contact. Who could touch whom was not an emotional question. It was a question of order. Touching when, where, and what context was all ritualized. Touch that was permitted within lawful marriage and religious rites, within power relations already established, was considered safe. Touch outside that frame was considered dangerous, suspicious, or depraved. And from there, the space between bodies began to carry moral meaning. Distance was not only physical distance, it became a sign of propriety. Keeping distance was keeping oneself clean. Moving too close was an intrusion not only into the body, but into the social order. And that order was not neutral. It was built to protect bodies considered proper by pushing other bodies farther away. Bodies deemed proper, nobles, clergy, the healthy members of the Orthodox community, were allowed to move close to one another. They had the right to touch, the right to stand close, the right to share space without being suspected. By contrast, bodies seen as low, impure, or suspicious had to keep their distance. The sick were isolated. The poor were pushed to the roadside. Those believed to carry moral sin were tightly monitored in every gesture. Distance in that logic was not a personal choice. It was a classification system. Who could stand near the center? Who was pushed to the margins? Whose body was considered safe? Whose body was always treated as a threat? What is striking is that these rules were not only imposed from above, they were internalized quickly. People learned to regulate their own distance, to step back, to avoid touch, to feel shame if they stood too close to someone they should not stand close to. No one needed to give orders. The body learned the lesson of order on its own. And as time passed, the original reasons, disease, sin, impurity, began to fade. But the reflex to keep distance remained. It was preserved, refined, and redefined in new languages: politeness, civilization, respect. Yet at a deeper level, It still carries the memory of the fear that another person's body might infect us with something unwanted, even if we can no longer name what that thing is. Today, when someone stands too close, discomfort appears instantly. Not because you think they carry disease or sin, but because your body has learned over centuries that distance is safety, that moving too close is wrong. And when someone breaks that boundary, the reflex arrives before thought. Here, the concept of personal space reveals its historical nature. It did not begin as a right, but as a defense mechanism. Not to protect the individual from emotional violation, but to protect order from bodies seen as dangerous. And when that mechanism passes through generations, it becomes part of what feels normal, so normal that we forget. It was once fear organized into practice. Personal space, then, is not only about you. It is about how society learned to arrange human bodies in shared space. Who is allowed near? Who must remain far? Who may touch? Who may not? And even though we have changed the explanations, that basic reflex remains like a quiet medieval memory still alive in the unconscious step back when someone comes too close. From there, personal space becomes more than comfort. It becomes a moral boundary. Keeping the right distance is keeping oneself clean. Violating distance is a sign of chaos, lack of control, or sin. Today we speak of personal space as a psychological right. But the discomfort you feel when someone stands too close in an elevator or a line is not purely biological instinct. It is cultural memory. A memory that another person's body could carry something unwanted, even if we can no longer name what it is. Hierarchical language is where bodily insecurity gets converted into speech. In medieval society, the body was not judged only by shape or health. It was judged by position. Who stood above whom? Who bowed? Who knelt? Who could meet someone's eyes? Who had to avoid a gaze? The body in social space always said something about power, and to reinforce that message, language was enlisted. Forms of address titles, ritual phrases did not exist to make communication more efficient. They existed to place bodies in the correct place. When you call someone by a title, you are not only acknowledging their social position, you are adjusting your own inner posture. You are making yourself smaller. You are making your body less dangerous. This continues in the modern world, even though the forms have changed. We no longer bow before a lord, but we change our voice when speaking to a superior. We choose words more carefully. We soften our presence. And all of this happens so naturally that we rarely notice the body is being adjusted through language. Hierarchical language helps society run smoothly, but it also reinforces a medieval assumption that the body must be placed within order so it does not create disturbance. And when that order is broken, when someone speaks out of role, stands in the wrong place, touches at the wrong time, discomfort arises immediately. The common thread connecting handshake, personal space, and hierarchical language is this: they are all mechanisms that soothe anxiety about the presence of other bodies. They allow people to live close to one another without falling into panic. But to do that, they must assume that without ritual, the body would be a threat. In the Middle Ages, that assumption is easy to understand. Disease spread fast. Violence was common. Power was expressed through flesh. But what is worth thinking about is this: we still live by that assumption, even though the context has changed dramatically. We still need rituals in order to touch. We still need boundaries in order to stand. We still need language in order to place ourselves correctly. And when those rituals are interrupted, when someone does not shake hands, stands too close, or speaks improperly, a sense of unease appears quickly, almost instinctively. Here, the medieval inheritance does not lie in the specific form of each ritual. It lies in the underlying belief that social order must begin with controlling the body. and that if we do not do that, chaos will appear not at the level of ideas, but at the level of the physical, who stands where, who touches, whom, who speaks to whom, in what tone. This chapter is not trying to say these rituals are wrong. They help us live together. But what is worth reflecting on is what they cost our own sense of bodily freedom. When the body must always be controlled, adjusted, and placed into a mold, then bodily freedom becomes more fragile than we assume. And perhaps the deepest legacy the Middle Ages left is not a set of specific rules, but a lingering feeling that the body, if not managed, will cause trouble. A feeling that makes us constantly monitor ourselves, how we stand, how we touch, how we speak, to ensure our presence does not make someone else uneasy. In that logic, the body was never completely safe. It was only safe when it was in the right place at the right time within the right ritual. And that is a very old lesson still practiced every day, not through laws, but through reflex. There is a very modern belief we carry with us every day, usually without noticing it, that once something is written down, it becomes more stable, safer, more correct. Paperwork signatures, seals, those things give us the feeling that the world has been arranged, that chaos has been stopped at the doorway. But this belief was not born in the age of offices or the modern state. It is the crystallization of a very medieval obsession, the fear that order is fragile. For much of the Middle Ages, order was not something obvious. It was not guaranteed by a strong administrative system, nor protected by a unified legal code. Order existed as a temporary condition, always at risk of coming apart. Local wars, disease, famine, territorial disputes, any of these could tear the rhythm of life apart in a matter of weeks. In a world like that, recording became an act of defense. Paper, in its earliest purpose, was not created to make life easier. It was created out of fear, a fear that is very specific and very ancient: forgetting. In the medieval world, forgetting was not neutral. It was a threat. What was forgotten could be taken. What was not remembered could be denied. And the person who left no trace could be erased from the order of things without violence ever being necessary. When ownership was not written down, it did not merely lack evidence. It lacked leverage against power. A plot of land, a house, a privilege, if it existed only in memory, that memory could always be rewritten by someone stronger. In a society where force often decided what was true, having no document meant always standing in a weaker position. And so writing became a form of self-defense. The same was true of promises. A promise that was spoken could dissolve with time, circumstance, or the shifting will of human beings. But once a promise was written down, it entered a different state. It no longer depended entirely on goodwill. It became an object that could be carried, produced, and invoked before the community. Writing in that logic was not communication. It was anchoring. And when order had no material trace, it became dangerously fragile. A custom that was not recorded could be reinterpreted. A rule with no written text could be denied the moment it stopped being convenient. Order, if it existed only as an oral agreement, was always vulnerable to challenge, not by what was right, but by what was strong. That is why text gradually became a tool of existence. Not only existence in a legal sense, but existence inside collective memory. City charters, royal decrees, contracts between families, genealogies of lineages, all of them did the same thing. They tried to fix a world that was drifting. They did not simply describe reality as it was. They froze one version of reality and declared that this version had lasting value. What is notable is that this freezing was not neutral. When something was written down, it was not merely recorded. It was upgraded. It became more solemn, harder to deny, and therefore more powerful. Writing created a very strong illusion that what is written is durable and what is not written is easily lost. Here, writing was not just symbols. It was a witness. It said this happened. This was recognized. And because it had been placed into a material form, parchment ink, a seal, it could not be overturned arbitrarily. To deny it, a person had to do more than simply say the opposite. They had to rewrite it. This explains why in the Middle Ages, controlling writing was also controlling order. Who was allowed to write? Who was allowed to read? Who was allowed to keep the documents? Not everyone had the right to freeze reality in this way. Literacy and documentation were privileges, and that privilege carried power, the power to decide what would be remembered and what would be forgotten. When a family kept a carefully recorded genealogy, they were not only preserving memory, they were protecting their position in society. When a city posted its charter, it was not only organizing life, it was declaring that its order had continuity, did not depend entirely on the people currently alive. From there, a deep link formed between writing and reassurance. Writing things down was not only for remembering, it was to keep chaos out. And when that link was reinforced across generations, people began to believe that what was not written down was not fully real, not fully safe, not fully trustworthy. That inheritance reaches into the present. When we seek security in documents, contracts, written confirmation, we are repeating a very old reflex, a reflex born in an era when order was always at risk of disappearing, and writing was one of the few ways to keep it standing. Paperwork, then, is not merely an administrative tool. It is the trace of a fear of being erased. And every time we hold a document that has been signed and sealed, what reassures us is not only its content, but the feeling that reality, at least this part of it, has been held in place, not allowed to drift away with memory or temporary power. But along with that reassurance, a new obsession appears. The obsession that if it is not written down, it may not exist. Medieval law did not develop as a complete system, but as a continuous patch. Each rule was created to solve a specific fear, fear of land disputes, fear of betrayal, fear of rebellion, fear of moral chaos. And because fear changed with circumstances, the law expanded with it. Not because society loved control, but because society did not trust that order could stand on its own. This created a familiar loop. The more rules, the more exceptions. The more exceptions, the more rules were needed. The result was a dense web of overlapping texts, where order was protected, not through flexibility, but through thickness. If every possibility had already been written in advance, then chaos would have nowhere left to slip in. But an order built this way has a crucial feature. It depends on paper more than on people. When law becomes complex, personal trust declines. Instead of trusting words, people trust documents. Instead of trusting communal memory, people trust seals. And then a subtle shift occurs. Morality no longer lives mainly in behavior, but in the ability to prove oneself on paper. Whoever has papers has the right. Whoever lacks papers becomes suspicious. Whoever cannot produce the proper document may be assumed to be hiding something even when they have done nothing wrong. In this logic, lacking paperwork becomes a form of deviation. When the modern state was born, it did not break this medieval logic. It inherited it and expanded it. Modern administration does not merely use paperwork to function. It is built upon paperwork. Birth certificates, certifications, permits, contracts. Records, each sheet becomes a piece of legal identity. Without them, you do not merely face inconvenience. You become faint in the eyes of the system. Here, the obsession with order reaches a new level. Order is no longer simply about society not collapsing. It becomes the demand that everything have a clear place in a file. Who you are, where you belong, what you are allowed to do, what you are not. And if there is a gap in that chain of paperwork, unease appears immediately not only for authorities, but for the individual as well. You begin to ask yourself, did I follow the procedure correctly? Not did I do the right thing, but the right process. That difference matters, because it shows how order has shifted from the moral realm into the administrative realm. Right is no longer right according to conscience. Right is right according to the record. Modern reassurance therefore becomes tied to completeness of paperwork. When everything is signed, stamped, filed, you feel relief even if the outcome is not truly fair. And when something is right in human terms, but missing one document, one signature, one confirmation, you feel anxious as if order is threatened by a small detail. What is worth thinking about is that this obsession with order does not live only in institutions. It has entered personal life. We learn to store, classify, and prove ourselves. Personal files, degrees, achievements, work histories. Each one is an invisible document saying I am valid. And when one piece is missing, we feel not enough. Here the medieval inheritance becomes clear. In a world that once feared chaos so deeply it had to write everything down, we have learned to believe that order comes from being recorded. And so we monitor ourselves by that standard. Not have I lived decently, but can I prove that I have lived correctly? Paper in that logic is no longer a means. It becomes proof of existence. And law from a tool to protect the community becomes the net that shapes how we understand ourselves. This chapter is not meant to deny the value of law or paperwork. Without them, modern society cannot function. But what deserves a pause is why we feel such deep unease when faced with an administrative gap. Why a small procedural mistake can trigger fear that is out of proportion. And why being right on paper can sometimes matter more than being right as a person. The answer lies in the collective memory of an era when order always stood on the edge of collapse. The Middle Ages taught people that order had to be anchored in writing, or it would drift away. And that lesson sank so deep that even when the context changed, the reflex remained intact. We continue to write, continue to sign, continue to stamp. Not only to manage the world, but to reassure ourselves that the world is still in its proper place. And in every completed document, perhaps what we seek is not only legitimacy, but something much older, the feeling that chaos has been pushed back at least for one more day. Turkey so. There are cities that exist as geography, and there are cities that exist as an idea. Rome belongs to the second kind. Throughout many centuries of the Middle Ages, Rome was not merely a place. It was a living moral standard, a center that sent out signals of right and wrong, clean and unclean, salvation and corruption. And precisely because it was placed in that role, Rome gradually developed something no less powerful, a moral addiction. To understand this, we need to begin with a paradox. Rome was a holy city, and at the same time a city saturated with memories of violence, ruin, secular power, and compromise. Its stone roads had witnessed an empire rise and fall. Its arenas had been stained with blood. Its palaces had been theaters of political schemes. And then, on that very ground, the church erected a new assertion: this is the spiritual center of the Christian world. This sanctification did not erase the past. It laid a moral layer over the past. Rome did not need to be pure in order to become holy. It needed to be defined as the place with the authority to decide what purity is. In the Middle Ages, moral power did not come only from doctrine. It came from centrality. Rome was seen as closer to God not because of geography, but because history was told that way. Relics were brought here. Stories of martyrdom were attached to each stone. Every church, every square became part of one larger narrative, the narrative of salvation through order. And when a city is granted the authority to define morality, it begins to develop a particular need to judge continuously. Not because judgment produces truth, but because judgment reinforces position. Rome did not only bless, Rome also condemned. And in the medieval world, these two actions were almost impossible to separate. The moral addiction begins here. To maintain the image of holiness, Rome needed to keep pointing to what was not holy. To keep its role as the center, Rome needed to keep drawing boundaries: who is inside, who is outside, who is correct in faith, who is deviant, who must be saved, who must be excluded. Morality in that logic was not merely guidance for living. It was an instrument of governance. What is notable is this: Rome did not impose morality by creating perfect people. It imposed morality by standardizing repentance. In medieval Christianity, no one was expected to be sinless, but everyone was expected to know they were sinful and to know where to go to be absolved. And that place was Rome, or at least the structures of power radiating from Rome. Here, a subtle psychological mechanism emerged. People were not only taught how to live correctly, they were taught how to feel wrong, how to feel lacking, how to feel in need of correction. And when that feeling is cultivated long enough, it becomes a need, the need to be judged, the need to be examined, the need to be told that one is on the right path or must turn back. Rome's moral addiction was not simple strictness. It was a system in which sin was produced, distributed, and processed. Sin brought people back. Confession bound them closer. And that loop kept the moral center perpetually necessary. In the medieval imagination, Rome was not only the geographic center of Christianity, it was the center of form. Everything there was arranged to create the sensation that the sacred always stood above the ordinary, not through content, but through distance. That distance began with things that seemed purely external: thick, heavy vestments, towering mitres, white gloves, gold rings, rosaries, incense. The priestly body was no longer an ordinary body. It was wrapped, layered, lifted out of everyday life. Each layer of cloth did not merely cover flesh, it covered human ordinariness. When someone put on ceremonial dress, they were not simply performing a function. They were stepping into a moral role. Ritual did the same thing to time and space. Every movement had an order. Every phrase had a formula. Every silence was defined. There was no room for randomness, no room for spontaneous personal emotion. In ritual, a person was not allowed to be themselves. They had to be the correct role. And that is what created the sense that morality was not something lived, but something performed correctly. Latin completed the mechanism. A language not everyone understood, but everyone had to hear. It was not meant to convey content. It was meant to assert authority. When prayer is no longer something you understand, it becomes something you believe others understand on your behalf. And from that moment, morality no longer resides in inner experience. It rests in the hands of those who can interpret. These three elements, vestments, ritual, language, combined to produce an extremely refined system, a system of moral dependence. People no longer asked, "Am I living rightly?" They asked, "Am I being recognized as right?" Validation no longer came from within. It came from outside. And that outside had a center: Rome. When morality is pushed out of everyday life and placed into form, it changes its nature. It is no longer an ongoing choice shaped by lived circumstances. It becomes a sequence of examinations. Each day is no longer a flow, it is a silent test. How you eat, how you speak, how you think, when you remain silent. Everything becomes available to scrutiny. More importantly, you are not only examined by others, you learn to examine yourself. This is the decisive shift. Rome did not need to send officials to every village, every home. Rome only needed to teach people how to look at themselves through Rome's eyes. And so the gaze appears. Not a physical gaze, not the constant presence of a priest, a cleric, or a judge. But the sensation that someone could see, that someone could evaluate, remember, condemn. That gaze did not need to be permanently present. The possibility of presence was enough. In modern psychology, we would call that the internalization of power. But in the medieval world, it was simpler and heavier. People believed they were always living before the face of God and before the face of those who represented God. The crucial difference lies here. God in theology is omniscient, but the system that represents God can be wrong. Yet people were not allowed to doubt that, because doubting the system was itself a moral failure. And so the loop closed. You live under the gaze, you police yourself, and you have no right to question the gaze. Moral addiction does not stop at distinguishing right from wrong. It spreads into other territories: the body, food, speech, thought. Anything can become a moral issue if placed in the right frame. And Rome, as the center, had the authority to decide the frame. Here we see something familiar from earlier chapters. Morality is not designed to make people better in a simple sense. It is designed to make people more manageable. When every behavior can be labeled, people become cautious. When caution becomes habit, order is maintained without constant violence. Rome was not the only place to do this. But Rome did it with the credibility of history. And that credibility made every judgment feel inevitable, as though morality were not a social political choice, but a timeless truth. The irony is this: precisely by becoming the moral center, Rome also became obsessed with its own image. Any deviation within was twice as dangerous. Corruption, luxury, political compromise, all of it existed, but it had to be covered with even stronger moral language. The more contradictions, the stronger the addiction to judgment became. This is the familiar spiral of moral power to conceal the center's imperfections. The system must produce more standards, more targets of judgment, more boundaries. And gradually, morality is no longer a compass. It becomes fuel. This legacy did not vanish when the Middle Ages ended. It only changed shape. New Romes appeared not necessarily as cities, but as cultural, political, media centers. But the logic remained the same: whoever holds the power to define morality holds the power to shape order. And wherever that power exists, it is easy to fall into the addiction of judgment. This chapter is not meant to condemn Rome as a historical villain. Rome was a product of fear, chaos, and the need for stability. But what is worth remembering is this: when morality becomes a center of power, it rarely stops at guidance. It wants repetition, expansion, application. And sometimes it needs people to keep feeling not good enough in order to continue existing. Rome, the holy city, therefore, was not only a place of faith. It was evidence of a deeply enduring medieval lesson that morality, when organized into power, can become an addiction, and that addiction does not require violence to sustain itself. It only requires people to keep returning, seeking confirmation that they are living correctly from a center that is always ready to judge. Marriage forbidden without the Lord's permission. A single concise sentence, yet it is enough to expose the full harshness of life for the lowest classes in medieval society. Not because the rule was brutal in a blood-soaked way, but because it intervened directly in the most private aspect of human life: the right to form a family. For modern people, marriage is a personal choice, the outcome of affection and freedom. But for countless serfs, tenant farmers, and hired laborers in the Middle Ages, marriage was first and foremost a matter of governance. It did not belong to the heart. It belonged to order. In feudal society, land lay at the center of all power. Whoever owned the land did not merely own fields and soil, but also the right to control the people who lived upon it. Peasants were not regarded as independent individuals, but as units of labor bound tightly to the land. They plowed, paid rent, performed corvée labor, repaired roads, built bridges, and in many cases were required to go to war. Where they lived, whom they worked for, and even whom they married, could directly affect the functioning of the estate. In that context, marriage ceased to be a private affair. It became an economic variable. When two people married, especially if they belonged to different estates, the system was immediately confronted with practical questions. Where would they live? For whom would they labor? To which lord would their children belong? A woman's marriage could mean the loss of a laborer from the land that depended on her work. A man's marriage could require additional land and resources to sustain a household. Every marriage, therefore, had the potential to disrupt the fragile balance of agricultural production. This is why many lords imposed a requirement no one could marry without their consent. In many regions of Europe, particularly in England and France, there existed regulations requiring serfs to seek permission or pay a marriage fee, often known as merchet. On paper, this fee was justified as compensation to the lord for the loss of labor. In practice, it functioned as a powerful instrument of control. Without money, you could not marry. If you wished to marry someone from another village, the risk of refusal was high. And if you married without permission, the consequences could be far more severe than a fine. The repercussions of an unauthorized marriage extended well beyond money. A family could lose the right to use land, be forced into additional labor, or even be expelled from the village. In a society where protective networks were extremely fragile, being pushed outside the community meant poverty, vagrancy, and the constant risk of starvation. For women, the danger was even greater. An unrecognized wife might have no inheritance rights, no protection, and could easily become an object of exploitation. The law did not need to imprison or beat people. Simply expelling them from the social order was enough to destroy them. What is striking is that such laws did not exist because medieval people despised love. On the contrary, they understood the value of family very well. But precisely because family created deep social roots, it became something that had to be controlled. A single person was easier to relocate, easier to compel into labor, easier to expel. A person with a spouse, children, and land tied to marriage was far more difficult to move. Allowing marriage, therefore, was also a way of binding people in place. You could marry, but you would marry here. You could live, but only under predetermined conditions. The medieval church, in theological terms, regarded marriage as a sacred sacrament based on the free consent of two individuals. Yet in everyday life, the church rarely confronted secular lords directly over economic and social power. A marriage might be valid before God, but that did not guarantee the couple the right to reside or farm wherever they wished. The soul might be saved in church, but the body still had to survive in a material world controlled by landlords. The law forbidding marriage without permission possessed a particular strength it did not need to be enforced constantly. Its mere existence was enough to shape behavior. People learned not to love too openly, not to make promises too early, not to dream of a future beyond their assigned social position. Love, if it existed, had to be quiet and cautious. Not because people lacked emotion, but because emotion was not a legitimate basis for survival in a system that valued stability over freedom. It must be said that not all lords were cruel, and not all laws were rigidly enforced. In many places, peasants were allowed to marry relatively freely if no obvious economic risk was involved. But it was precisely this arbitrariness that made the law terrifying. Your life depended on another person's benevolence, and benevolence is not a right. It can be granted today and withdrawn tomorrow. Harsh medieval laws were not born of personal sadism. They were not designed to cause pain in a deliberate sense. They were created to keep a fragile system functioning. In a world of low productivity, unpredictable natural disasters, ineffective medicine, and near-constant warfare society had little room for flexibility. Everything had to remain still long enough to survive. To achieve that individual freedom was treated as a risk rather than a value. Restrictions on movement kept labor where it was needed. Control over marriage and reproduction ensured that population levels did not swing dangerously in sensitive periods. The maintenance of inheritance order prevented land disputes, the very foundation of the economy. Each rule taken in isolation may appear inhumane, but when viewed as part of a whole, they resemble support beams holding up a cracked building. The problem was that these beams were erected using people's private lives. For the lowest classes, marriage was not a promise of the future, but an application to remain within the present. Permission to live with the person one chose. Permission to have children without punishment, expulsion, or loss of land. This was not the language of romance. It was the language of survival. The family, often imagined today as a private refuge, was then the direct point of contact between power and the human body. From a modern perspective, such laws are easy to condemn. They violate what we consider fundamental rights, the right to love, to marry, to determine one's own life. But if we momentarily set aside moral judgment, a more unsettling truth appears: medieval society operated under a constant fear of collapse. A failed harvest, a plague, or a prolonged war could push an entire estate into irreversible crisis. In that context, stability was not a choice. It was an obsession. And when stability becomes an obsession, freedom is always the first sacrifice. What makes this historical episode still relevant is not its backwardness, but the recurring pattern it reveals. Whenever a system feels itself on the brink of collapse, it tends to tighten control over private life. The difference between the Middle Ages and the present lies not in the nature of this reflex, but in how it is expressed. Today, few societies openly forbid marriage as feudal regimes once did. But control has not vanished. It has changed form. Instead of seeking permission from a lord, modern individuals seek permission from the economic system. Instead of being punished for marrying the wrong person, they are punished through living costs, housing prices, financial pressure, and job insecurity. Marriage is not banned, but postponed. Childbearing is not punished with whips, but with debt, inadequate welfare, and long-term anxiety. Freedom still exists on paper, but the conditions required to exercise it are increasingly narrow. Like medieval society, many modern societies prioritize stability over freedom, especially in times of crisis, economic recessions, pandemics, political unrest. Measures restricting movement, controlling labor, and managing livelihoods are justified by the same old logic. Without them, the system will collapse. And once again, private life becomes the most vulnerable space because it is difficult to measure yet directly affects social order. One significant difference is that modern people often believe such restrictions are temporary. Medieval people did not harbor that illusion. For them, limitation was the default condition of life. Tomorrow arrived not because of hope, but because order was held tightly enough. This does not make medieval society morally superior or inferior to ours, but it forces us to confront an uncomfortable question. Is individual freedom truly an absolute value, or is it always contingent on how stable a society feels it is? When examining harsh medieval laws, what matters is not only condemning injustice, but recognizing the mechanism behind it. People do not control one another's private lives because they enjoy doing so, but because they fear what will happen if they do not. And that fear, whether wrapped in feudal armor or modern administrative language, remains the most powerful driver of authority. History, therefore, does not merely recount obsolete laws. It issues a quiet warning whenever a society begins to say that stability matters more than freedom private life will be the first place to pay the price. The Middle Ages show this in its rawest form. The present shows it in a more refined one. But the essence of the problem has never disappeared. Laws forbidding marriage without permission thus do more than tell the story of the suffering of the lowest classes. They tell the story of a society that managed people as resources of a world in which privacy was never considered self-evident. And when we read these laws today, what matters is not only outrage at their severity, but the recognition that the rights we now take for granted once did not exist at all. They emerged very slowly, very late, and always at a cost. Trial by ordeal. The trial by ordeal was one of the strangest mechanisms in medieval law, not simply because it was brutal in a straightforward sense, but because it reveals an entire way of thinking, a world in which justice was not only a human matter, but God's. A court that did not merely ask who did it, but whom does God confirm from a modern perspective, plunging a hand into boiling water or carrying red-hot iron to prove innocence sounds like punishment disguised as proof. Yet for many European communities of the time, it could seem like a reasonable, even fair path in a society where material evidence was scarce, scientific investigation did not exist, and testimony was often stretched and warped by hatred, fear, or social rank. When people could not know the truth with human eyes, they lifted the question to the eyes of heaven and called that justice. To understand trial by ordeal, we have to place it inside the proper foundation of medieval law, a legal world that ran on honor oaths, community, and the belief that cosmic order could intervene directly in everyday life. In many regions, especially societies shaped by post-Roman Germanic legal traditions, courts did not always have professional judges or investigative prosecution systems like those of today. Disputes often began with an accusation: this person stole, that person committed adultery, that one blasphemed. And the next question was, who is credible? A defendant might bring relatives or neighbors as compurgators, oath helpers, who swore that they believed the accused was innocent. But oaths could be bought coerced or bent under fear. When a community was split or suspicion had grown too heavy, the system needed a final anchor beyond human speech, a sign that everyone would be forced to bow before. And here trial by ordeal entered as a ritual that was both legal and religious. God would not allow an innocent person to be harmed. At least that was the belief that made the entire mechanism run. The boiling water ordeal is the most iconic image. The suspect had to thrust a hand into a cauldron of boiling water to retrieve an object, often a stone or a ring, dropped to the bottom. The depth and duration could be standardized according to the seriousness of the charge. A lesser accusation might require reaching only shallowly, a heavier one deeper. Afterward, the hand would be wrapped in cloth and sealed, and the accused would wait several days. 3 days is often mentioned before the bandage was opened in front of witnesses. If the burn healed well, meaning minimal blistering, little oozing, no severe rot or infection, the accused was declared innocent. If the wound looked bad, the person was judged guilty. Notice this: the verdict did not occur at the moment the hand touched boiling water. It occurred at the moment the community looked at the wound and read it as a message. And it is precisely in that waiting period that medieval law reveals its ritual nature. Justice is not only a conclusion, but a process of producing social consensus around a visible sign. The hot iron ordeal was even more direct. The accused had to carry a bar of red-hot iron for a set distance, sometimes 3 steps, sometimes 9, then set it down. The hand would be wrapped, days would pass, and the wound would be inspected, as in the boiling water ordeal. Here, truth was placed into the body, not metaphorically, but in an intensely physical way. The body became a legal document. What made this persuasive for people of the time was their belief that God could intervene in matter. If God created the world, God could also govern a burn. If God was justice, God could not allow justice to be publicly humiliated. A society that believed this would see a well-healed wound not merely as luck, but as the highest verdict. There was another form that sounds even more chilling, the cold water ordeal, often tied to suspicions of witchcraft, or crimes marked as impure. The accused would be bound and lowered into water. If the person sank, the water was said to receive them. Therefore, they were innocent, even though the risk of drowning was very real. If the person floated, they were judged guilty because the water rejected the impure. The cruel paradox was, an innocent person might die in order to prove innocence. But in the logic of the time, death did not destroy justice. It completed it in a world where earthly life was not the final point. When belief in the soul and eternal judgment was real, a legal system could accept a wager on the flesh, because the flesh was understood to be fragile anyway. Still, it would be wrong to see trial by ordeal as mere blind savagery. It functioned and endured for so long because it answered a specific social need, producing a conclusion the community could accept when evidence was lacking. Imagine a small medieval village. Someone is accused of theft. There are no cameras, no fingerprints, no bank records. Property is scarce, but honor is everything. If the court cannot produce a clear decision, resentment will smolder, families will retaliate, violence will escalate. Trial by ordeal offered an exit. Instead of two families destroying each other, they poured the dispute into a ritual. And when the ritual ended, they could say, "It wasn't my judgment, God judged." That is a subtle social technology. It shifts the moral burden of judgment away from human beings, dampening cycles of revenge. And because it was a ritual, it often carried a strongly church-like atmosphere. Prayers, hymns, admonitions, sometimes even being performed within religious space under the presence of clergy. This matters. Clergy were not merely people who asked for miracles. They were the guarantors of the ritual's legitimacy. An ordeal without clergy was like a trial without a seal. The church's participation made the ordeal a communal event wrapped in sacred meaning, and therefore increased the community's willingness to accept the outcome. But trial by ordeal also reveals the darker side of power. If society believes justice comes through supernatural signs, then whoever controls the ritual holds enormous soft power. Whether a wound heals quickly or heals badly does not depend only on miracles. It depends on rudimentary medicine, bandaging infection, individual physiology, and even on the way people look. A community can be guided to see what it wants to see. In those cases, the ordeal stops being God's justice and becomes prejudice wearing God's clothing. This is why, over time, as European legal thought developed, the ordeal was increasingly seen as a dangerous shortcut. It allowed violence and belief to replace investigation and reasoning. A major turning point came in the early 13th century, when the Western Church, especially through the Fourth Lateran Council of 1215, sharply restricted clergy participation in ordeals. Once clergy withdrew, trial by ordeal lost its most important sacred seal. Not because people suddenly stopped believing, but because the legal system gradually shifted its center of gravity from supernatural signs to evidence testimony procedure and the professionalization of courts. Other forms of adjudication expanded newer investigative models, juries in some regions, and even the judicial duel, which for a time continued as another kind of judgment of God through rule-bound violence. Yet across these forms, a similar thread remains. The Middle Ages continually tried to ensure that verdicts did not appear as personal opinions, but as outcomes of something larger: God, honor, law, or ritual. In the end, what makes trial by ordeal most worth thinking about is not boiling water or hot iron. It is the way human beings used pain to create certainty. When truth is hard to grasp, societies can be tempted by mechanisms that deliver clear conclusions, even if the price is the human body. And this story is not dead. It has only changed clothing. Today we have science, data, procedural standards. Yet the psychological need remains the need to see a simple sign and believe justice has been done. When public opinion demands a public confession rather than a long investigation. When people trust collective intuition more than evidence. When a small tear in someone's public image is treated as proof of their entire character. This too is a kind of ordeal, only a social ordeal rather than one of fire and water. Medieval law through trial by ordeal reminds us that justice is not only the question of right or wrong, but also the question of who has the power to define right and wrong. In a world that placed God at the center, the ordeal was society's way of both fearing and longing for reassurance that order still existed. And perhaps the most unsettling point is this: people are often willing to place someone on the scales if in exchange they can feel that uncertainty has been pushed back. If you are hearing this at night, try to imagine a moment, a person standing before a pot of boiling water, their hand trembling not entirely from pain, but from the gaze of the whole community, placing their future into a wound. In that moment, law is no longer writing. It is collective breath, collective belief, and sometimes collective fear turned into ritual. The Middle Ages are not strange because people believed in miracles. They are strange because they dared to turn miracles into legal procedure. But if we look closer, we may find a more uncomfortable truth. Modern people may have abandoned the boiling pot and the glowing iron, yet we have never fully abandoned the craving for a quick sign that ends suspicion and calls itself fairness. There is a very comforting illusion that modern people often believe in without noticing that we've gone far. Far from darkness, far from superstition, far from the rigid orders of the past. That the Middle Ages are a phase left behind, surpassed by the light of science, individuality, freedom. But if you listen more carefully, not to the noise of progress, but to the quiet operating rhythm of everyday life, you'll recognize something far more unsettling we never truly left. We only changed costumes. We traded the monk's robe for office clothes, church bells for alarm clocks, religious commandments for management terminology. But the structure underneath the way people are measured, judged, adjusted, still carries a very familiar shape. The Middle Ages did not disappear. They transformed. Look back at what we've walked through. Time was broken into smaller pieces not to serve the body, but to control it. Behavior was given moral labels not to nourish life, but to maintain order. Other people's bodies became threats that had to be managed. Paper became proof of existence. A moral center of power projected a gaze that made people police themselves. All of that sounds medieval, and yet it is also the foundation of modern life. We still live inside rigid schedules. We are still haunted by punctuality. We still feel guilty when we rest. We still believe there is a correct rhythm we must synchronize with if we don't want to be left behind. The only difference is this: no one stands in the bell tower anymore. The bell has been placed in our pockets. In the Middle Ages, people lived under the gaze of God and the Church. Today, we live under the gaze of things more abstract, but no less powerful: productivity norms, public opinion algorithms. No one says outright that you are sinning, but you are reminded that you are inefficient. No one condemns you as a sinner, but you are nudged to believe you are falling behind. The feeling is the same, only the language has changed. In the medieval world, sin had to be confessed. In the modern world, inadequacy has to be improved. Both create the same inner condition: people always feel they are not enough. And when people are not enough, they more easily accept guidance from the outside. They more easily accept systems that promise to fix them. The Middle Ages taught humanity a very deep lesson: order must be maintained, even when it exhausts people. Because chaos is more frightening than fatigue. Illness, famine, war, plague, all of it carved into collective memory, a fear without order, everything will collapse. That fear did not vanish with history. It was passed down. It changed form. Today we do not fear hell in the religious sense, but we fear being excluded from the system. We fear failure. We fear abandonment. We fear becoming invisible. And so we continue to obey. We obey work schedules. We obey social standards. We obey rhythms that are called normal. What matters is, the Middle Ages were not always cruel. They also offered a sense of safety. When everything is prescribed, people do not have to bear the burden of total choice. When there are rules, rituals, timetables, people know what they are supposed to do next. The fatigue of obedience is sometimes easier than the anxiety of absolute freedom. And that is why we keep so many medieval inheritances, even while believing we have progressed. We need order. We need rhythm. We need frames to hold on to. The problem is not whether there is order. The problem is that we forget order is a historical choice, not an eternal truth. When the Middle Ages defined morality, they did not ask whether people were happy. They asked whether people were obedient. Today, we also rarely ask ourselves whether we are living a meaningful life. We ask whether we are on schedule, whether we meet the standard, whether we are doing the right thing according to external measures. Those measures, whether named KPIs, social norms, or personal success, are all descendants of the same logic: life must be evaluated continuously. And when life becomes a sequence of evaluations, people gradually lose the ability to simply exist. We never left the Middle Ages because we never truly reopened the central question the Middle Ages left behind: who has the right to define what a correct life is? Back then, the answer was the Church. Today, the answer is more fragmented, more refined, harder to point to by name. But that power still exists. It lives in systems, in language, in the way we speak to ourselves. Every time you feel anxious for resting, every time you feel ashamed for not being productive enough, every time you feel you must prove your worth through busyness, that is not only personal psychology. That is history speaking. Understanding that we never left the Middle Ages is not meant to lead to despair. It is an invitation to clarity. An invitation to look directly at the invisible structures shaping our lives, not to destroy everything, but to become aware. Aware that time can be used, but it can also be lived. Aware that morality can guide, but it can also impose. Aware that order can protect, but it can also suffocate. And most importantly, aware that human beings were not born to become a project that must be endlessly optimized. If the Middle Ages left one greatest legacy, it is not stone cathedrals or ancient manuscripts. It is a way of seeing the human being as a creature that must be molded, corrected, and monitored so it does not stray from the common order. We carry that way of seeing into the modern world sometimes, without even noticing. And because we don't notice, we keep reproducing it every day in very small decisions: how we judge ourselves, how we look at others, how we define right and wrong. This chapter does not close the story with a final conclusion, because the very idea of a final conclusion is also a medieval habit, the desire for a last answer, a stable truth to hold on to. Instead, consider it a pause. A moment to ask, if we never left the Middle Ages, what does that say about our present? And if the Middle Ages still live in the way we organize time, morality, and ourselves, what would real freedom look like? Perhaps the first step is not to run faster, optimize harder, or fix ourselves better. Perhaps the first step is simply to stop long enough to hear the old bells still ringing inside modern life. And when you hear them, you will realize history is not behind us. It is walking with us quietly inside the very rhythms we think are new. I would truly love to hear from you. Where are you listening from? What time is it where you live, and more importantly, in your current life? Which medieval bell is still ringing the loudest? Leave your thoughts in the comments. I read them all, and it is those reflections that keep this story alive. If you want to continue these slow, deep journeys where history is not only told, but felt, follow the channel. We'll meet again in other quiet spaces of time.